The silence in the crowded bank was deafening the moment Richard Sterling prepared to strike his own pregnant wife. It was the defining act of a man who thought wealth placed him above the law and viewed others as mere garbage. Richard assumed he was untouchable and that her family was irrelevant, but he made a fatal miscalculation. He had no idea who her father actually was, or about the devastating secret buried for 3 decades that is about to surface. What follows isn't a legal battle, but scorched earth warfare. Watch until the very end. The revenge is absolute perfection. The marble floors of the Sovereign Capital Bank on Fifth Avenue usually only echoed the sounds of Italian leather shoes and hushed conversations about interest rates. It was a place where silence was a currency. But on a rainy Tuesday in November, that silence was shattered by a scream that would end a dynasty. Richard Sterling stood near the teller's counter. His face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He was wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than most people's cars, but in that moment, he looked like nothing more than a rabid animal. "I told you to stay in the car," Richard roared, his voice bouncing off the high, vaulted ceilings. Standing 5 feet away, clutching her swollen belly, was Sarah. She was 8 months pregnant, her face pale and drawn, wearing a raincoat that had seen better days. She looked small, fragile, and utterly terrified. "Richard, please," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "My card was declined at the pharmacy. I just need $20 for the prenatal vitamins. The doctor said. Richard mocked, throwing his hands up. The few customers in the bank, a young couple opening a savings account, an elderly woman organizing her pension, and the security guard by the door, all froze. "I am sick of you bleeding me dry, Sarah. You and that parasite inside you." The air in the bank seemed to vanish. The teller, a young woman named Jessica, stopped typing, her mouth slightly open. "It's your son, Richard," Sarah pleaded, taking a tentative step forward. Tears were mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Please, everyone is looking." "Let them look." Richard turned to the crowd, his eyes manic. "Take a good look. This is what happens when you marry beneath you. You get a leech." He turned back to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a cold, focused malice. "You want money. You want a handout. Go ask your loser father. Oh wait, he's probably too busy fixing toilets to help you." "Don't bring my dad into this," Sarah said, a sudden spark of defiance in her eyes. She reached out to touch his arm, a gesture of desperate de-escalation. That was the mistake. Richard recoiled as if burned. "Don't touch me!" And then he did the unthinkable, in a motion that seemed to happen in slow motion. For everyone watching Richard, Sterling, the CEO of Sterling and Oakhaven, pulled back his leg and kicked his wife. It wasn't a shove. It was a kick. His polished dress shoe connected with her thigh, just inches from her stomach. The sound was a dull thud, followed immediately by the crash of Sarah's body hitting the marble floor. She curled instantly into a ball, protecting her stomach, letting out a guttural sob of pain and shock. "Oh my God!" Jessica the teller screamed, slamming her hand onto the silent alarm button. The security guard, a burly man named Frank, who had been working at Sovereign Capital for 15 years, rushed forward. "Hey, back off now." Richard straightened his jacket, looking down at his wife with a look of pure disgust. He didn't look remorseful. He looked annoyed that his suit might be wrinkled. "She tripped," he spat out. "Clumsy cow." Sarah groaned on the floor, clutching her side. "My baby. Richard the baby. Get up," Richard hissed, stepping over her as if she were a piece of luggage dropped in a hotel lobby. Stop making a scene." Frank, the guard, stepped between them, his hand resting on his taser. "Sir, step away from the lady. Police are on the way." Richard laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "Do you know who I am? I have more money in this checking account than you'll make in 10 lifetimes. I own this branch's manager. Get out of my face." He turned to leave, adjusting his cuffs completely, ignoring the woman he had promised to cherish, who was now weeping on the cold floor. He walked toward the heavy glass doors, the rhythm of his heels clicking confidently. He thought it was over. He thought he had won. But as he pushed the doors open and stepped out into the rain, he didn't notice the grey sedan parked across the street. He didn't see the man sitting in the driver's seat, an older man with calloused hands and eyes like flint, watching the whole thing through the bank's glass facade. Sarah's father, Arthur, had seen everything. And Arthur wasn't just a plumber. To understand the explosion, you have to understand the fuse. The marriage between Richard Sterling and Sarah Miller had been a collision of two different worlds from the very beginning. Sarah was the daughter of Arthur Miller, a man known in their small town of Oakhaven only as the guy you called when your pipes burst at 3 a.m. He drove a rusted Ford F-150, wore flannel shirts that smelled of sawdust and copper, and lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of town. He was quiet, unassuming, and deeply private. Richard, on the other hand, was new money, trying desperately to look like old money. He had made a fortune in high-risk venture capital, aggressively buying out small tech firms, stripping them for parts and firing the staff. He was ruthless, charismatic, and entirely hollow. They met at a charity gala Sarah had catered. Richard was charmed by her innocence, her lack of pretension. He saw her not as a partner, but as a project, a pretty thing he could mold. "He's dangerous, Sarah," Arthur had told her 3 years ago, sitting at his kitchen table nursing a black coffee. "A man who talks about his money that much, he's trying to drown out something else. You just don't know him, Dad," Sarah had argued, her eyes shining with the illusion of love. "He's ambitious. He's going to take care of me." "I can take care of you," Arthur had said softly. Sarah had laughed then. "With what, Dad?" "The pension. I want a life. A big life." She got the big life, but it came with a golden cage. Within 6 months of the wedding, the isolation began. Richard moved them to a penthouse in the city, 2 hours away from Arthur. He criticized her clothes, her accent, her friends. He cut off her access to their joint accounts, giving her a humiliating allowance that he monitored down to the cent. By the time she became pregnant, Sarah was a ghost in her own home. But Richard made a fatal calculation error. He assumed Arthur was exactly what he looked like, a simple, poor tradesman. Richard never bothered to run a background check on his father-in-law. Why would he? Men like Richard didn't look down. They only looked up. If he had looked, he might have found the gap in Arthur's history. The 20 years between 1985 and 2005 where Arthur Miller didn't seem to exist on any public payroll in the United States. Back in the present inside the bank, the paramedics were lifting Sarah onto a stretcher. "I need to call my dad." She wept, her hand gripping the EMT's sleeve. "Please call Arthur." "We will, honey." The EMT soothed her. Outside, the grey sedan's engine turned over. Arthur didn't run into the bank. He didn't scream. He didn't confront Richard on the sidewalk. That was an amateur's move. That was emotional. Arthur was tactical. He picked up a burner phone from the passenger seat, a habit from a previous life he couldn't quite shake, and dialed a number that hadn't been active for a decade. It rang twice. "This is the bakery," a gruff voice answered. "I need to place an order," Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of the tremor that was shaking his hands. "For a demolition." "Arthur." The voice on the other end shifted, losing its casual tone. "Is that you? We thought you were dead." "Not yet," Arthur said, watching Richard's Porsche speed away from the curb. "But someone is going to wish they were. I need a full financial autopsy on Richard Sterling. Sterling and Oakhaven Ventures. I want to know where every dime is buried. I want to know who he owes, who he's sleeping with, and what laws he's breaking." "That's a big ask, Artie. It's been a long time." "I'm calling in the marker Saul, the Beirut marker." There was a heavy silence on the line, the kind of silence that acknowledges a debt that can never be fully repaid. "Done," Saul said. "Give me 24 hours." Arthur hung up. He watched the ambulance pull away with his daughter inside. He wiped a single tear from his cheek, and then his face hardened into stone. He drove to the hospital not as a grandfather-to-be, but as a handler preparing for an operation. Richard Sterling had kicked the wrong woman. He had just declared war on a ghost. The sterile smell of antiseptic and floor wax filled the hallway of St. Jude's Hospital. It was a smell Arthur knew well. It was the smell of bad news. He sat in the plastic chair outside room 304, his elbows on his knees, staring at his boots. They were old work boots, stained with years of labor, a stark contrast to the polished tiles. Inside the room, the doctors were monitoring the fetal heartbeat. The door creaked open, and a doctor stepped out. Dr. Evans looked tired. "Mr. Miller." Arthur stood up slowly. "How is she? How is the baby?" "Sarah is stable," Dr. Evans said, lowering his voice. "She has severe bruising on her hip and thigh, and she's in a state of extreme emotional shock. The stress induced some early contractions, but we've managed to stop them for now. The baby seems okay, but we need to keep her for observation for at least 48 hours. It was a close call, Arthur. Very close." Arthur nodded, his jaw set so tight it hurt. "And the police?" Dr. Evans sighed, looking uncomfortable. "2 officers stopped by. Detective Harrow and his partner. They took a statement from Sarah, but what? They said it's a he said, she said situation. They said since there's no footage released from the bank yet, and your son-in-law claims it was an accident, well, they aren't arresting him tonight." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just nodded again, a dark understanding passing behind his eyes. "Richard plays golf with the captain of the precinct," Arthur said quietly. "I know. I'm sorry," the doctor said. "I've documented the injuries. If you get a lawyer—" "I don't need a lawyer," Arthur said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Can I see her? Briefly." Arthur walked into the dimly lit room. Sarah looked tiny in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. When she saw her father, she broke. "Dad," she choked out, reaching for him. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. It felt cold. "I'm here, sweetie. I'm here." He didn't even look back," Sarah whispered, tears streaming into her ears. "He kicked me, Dad. He kicked our son. How could I be so stupid?" "You told me. You warned me." "Shh." Arthur smoothed her hair back. "None of that. You loved him. That's not a crime. What he did is the crime. He's going to take everything. She panicked, the heart monitor beeping faster. He told me before he left. He said if I leave him, he'll bury me in legal fees. He'll take the baby for full custody, just to spite me. He has millions, Dad. We have nothing. Arthur leaned in close. His eyes, usually warm and crinkled with age, were terrifyingly flat. Sarah, look at me. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. You focus on that baby. You eat, you sleep, you get strong. Do not worry about the money. Do not worry about Richard. But I promise you, Arthur said, squeezing her hand. Richard Sterling is already a dead man walking. He just doesn't know it yet. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Sterling was celebrating. He sat in a leather booth at the Obsidian, an exclusive members-only cigar bar. A glass of 50-year-old Scotch sat before him. Across the table was his lawyer, a weasel of a man named Timothy Thorne. Did you fix it? Richard asked, taking a drag of a Cuban cigar. Thorne smirked. The security tape from the bank has been misplaced. A technical glitch. It cost you a $10,000 donation to the Policeman's Benevolent Fund, but the investigation is dead in the water. As for the wife, ex-wife, Richard corrected. She has no resources, Thorne said. We'll file for divorce on grounds of mental instability. We'll paint a picture of her being hysterical hormonal. The courts will give you the kid you hire a nanny, and she goes back to the trailer park. Richard laughed, clinking his glass against Thorne's. God, I love this country. Money talks, bullshit walks. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A blocked number. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Annoyed, he picked it up. Who is this Mr. Sterling? A distorted voice said. It wasn't Arthur. It was someone else. We noticed a disturbance at the bank today. Richard froze. The arrogance drained from his face. I handled it. It was a domestic issue. Nothing that concerns the partners. Everything concerns the partners, Richard, the voice hissed. Attention is dangerous. The audit is coming on Friday. If your accounts aren't perfectly balanced, the domestic issue will be the least of your problems. The line went dead. Richard's hand shook as he put the phone down. He gulped the rest of his scotch. Everything okay? Thorne asked. Fine. Richard lied, wiping sweat from his upper lip. Just business. But it wasn't fine. Richard had a secret much darker than domestic abuse. And unbeknownst to him, Arthur Miller had just started digging exactly where Richard was trying to hide the bodies. 24 hours later, Arthur sat in the back of his plumbing van, parked in an alleyway, 3 blocks from Richard's office tower. The inside of the van didn't look like a plumber's vehicle. The tools, wrenches, pipes, snakes were pushed to the side. In the center was a laptop with military-grade encryption software connected to a satellite uplink. Sitting next to Arthur was Saul. Saul was a man who didn't officially exist. He was small, balding, and wore thick glasses, looking like a librarian. But 30 years ago, Saul had been the best intelligence analyst the agency had ever seen. You were right, Artie, Saul said, typing furiously. This guy isn't just a scumbag. He's a walking Ponzi scheme. Show me, Arthur said, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. Saul turned the screen. Richard Sterling presents himself as a venture capital genius. He buys companies, flips them. But look at the cash flow. Arthur squinted at the lines of code and bank transfers. He's broke, Saul said. Broke? Arthur asked. He drives a Porsche. He lives in a $5 million penthouse. Leased, rented, leveraged, Saul explained. He's robbing Peter to pay Paul. But here is the twist. The people he's borrowing from, they aren't banks. Saul pulled up a grainy photo of a shipping container logo. He's washing money for the Volkov Syndicate, Russian organized crime. They funnel dirty cash into his tech startups. He cleans, it takes a 5% cut, and sends it back. Arthur whistled low. That explains the arrogance. He thinks he's protected. He was, Saul said. Until yesterday. See, Richard has been skimming. He's been taking more than his 5%. He's stolen about $3 million from the Russians to fund his lifestyle. He's been cooking the books to hide it from them. Arthur's eyes went cold. And he kicked Sarah because she asked for $20. Because he didn't have $20, Saul corrected. His liquidity is zero. He's terrified. If the Russians find out he's stealing from them, they won't sue him. They'll skin him. When do they audit him? Arthur asked. Friday, Saul said. Every quarter. That's 2 days away. Arthur leaned back, a plan forming in his mind. It wasn't enough to just expose Richard to the police. If the police arrested him, Richard might cut a deal. He might survive. Arthur didn't want him to survive. He wanted him obliterated. Can we access the bank's server? The one where the incident happened, Arthur asked. Sovereign Capital. Saul cracked his knuckles. Artie, I built their firewall in '98 before I retired. I have the back door key. Good, Arthur said. Here is what we are going to do. We aren't going to steal his money. We're going to expose the theft to the people he fears most. Just then, Arthur's phone rang. It was Sarah. She was crying again. Dad, he's here. Richard is here. Arthur's blood ran cold. At the hospital? Yes, he has papers. He says if I don't sign a non-disclosure agreement right now, admitting that I attacked him, he's going to stop paying the hospital bills. He says he'll have me transferred to a state ward. Put him on the phone, Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. He won't talk to you, Dad. He's laughing. He's shouting at the nurses. Put the phone on speaker, Sarah. Just do it. There was a rustle, and then Richard's voice came through loud and tinny. I don't care what your father thinks. The old man plunges toilets for a living. Sign the paper, Sarah, or you're out on the street tonight. Richard, Arthur said. The voice projected from the phone was low, steady, and terrifying. Oh, the plumber speaks, Richard sneered. Listen to me, old man. Stay out of this. You can't afford a lawyer, and you certainly can't afford to fight me. I don't need a lawyer, Richard, Arthur said. I need you to listen very carefully. You have 48 hours until Friday. Until the audit. The line went silent. The background noise of the hospital seemed to vanish. What did you say? Richard's voice dropped an octave. The Volkov audit, Arthur continued. I know about the $3 million you skimming, Richard. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands where you're hiding their money. I know about the cooked ledgers. Who is this? Richard stammered. You're a plumber. I was a lot of things before I was a plumber, Arthur said. Now get out of that room. Leave my daughter alone. If you ever come near her again, I won't call the police. I'll forward your real balance sheet to the contact named Ivan in your phone. There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps retreating hurriedly. A door slammed. Dad? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. What did you do? He looked like he saw a ghost. I just reminded him of reality, Arthur said gently. Rest now, Sarah. The war has just begun. Arthur hung up and looked at Saul. "He's going to run," Saul said. "He's going to try to take the money and run before Friday." "I know," Arthur said, starting the van's engine. "And we're going to be the ones to pack his bags. But there's one more twist, Saul. One thing Richard doesn't know about that bank account." "What's that?" "The account he's using to launder the money. It's a legacy account." Arthur smiled grimly. "It was opened 30 years ago under the name Spectre. It requires 2 signatures to withdraw more than 10 grand. "Who is the second signatory?" Saul asked. Arthur pulled a faded, yellowing key card from his wallet. "I am." Wednesday night was a blur of panic for Richard Sterling. He was in his office at the top of the Sterling Tower, the city lights sprawling below him like a bed of diamonds he could no longer touch. His shirt was unbuttoned, his tie on the floor. He had spent the last 3 hours shredding documents and wiping hard drives. He had decided to run. He would take the $3 million he had stolen from the Volkoff's charter, a private jet to Belize, and disappear before the Friday audit. He would leave Sarah and the baby to rot. He didn't care. Survival was the only metric that mattered. He logged into the secure terminal to initiate the wire transfer. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Destination: Cayman Islands, holding 44. Amount $3,200,000. Action transfer. He hit enter, holding his breath. A red box flashed on the screen. Access denied. Error code 99. Dash Spectre. Secondary signatory required. "What?" Richard screamed, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. "There is no secondary signatory. It's my account," he typed furiously, pulling up the account's administrative details. The account, Spectre Holdings, had been purchased by his brokers 5 years ago as a dormant shell corporation to move money through. They told him it was clean. They told him it was empty. They were wrong. Richard stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. Under primary holder, it listed his name. But under founding signatory veto power, there was a name that made no sense. Arthur J. Miller. Status active. Richard fell back into his chair, gasping for air. "The plumber," he whispered. "The plumber owns the shell company." It was impossible, and yet the pieces slammed together. Arthur's calm demeanor, the threat on the phone, the knowledge of the audit. Richard grabbed his phone and dialed Arthur. It rang 4 times before the old man picked up. "You're trying to move the money, Richard," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "How?" Richard hissed, his voice cracking. "How is your name on my account? You built your castle on my land, boy," Arthur said, his voice sounding like distant thunder. "That shell company Spectre, I set that up in 1988 for an operation in East Berlin. I haven't used it since the wall came down. When your shady brokers went looking for a dormant company to buy, they found mine. They didn't check the fine print. I still hold the master key." "Sign it over," Richard demanded, though he was shaking. "Sign the release, Arthur. If I don't get that money, the Russians kill me. Do you hear me? I'm a dead man." "I know," Arthur said, "and I don't care." "I'll give you half," Richard pleaded. 1.5 million. Think of what you could do. You could retire. You could help Sarah." "I don't want your blood money," Arthur replied. "Then what do you want?" Richard screamed into the empty office. "I want you to admit what you are," Arthur said. "Meet me at Sovereign Capital tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. before the branch opens. Bring your laptop. If you do exactly what I say, I might let you live. And if I don't, then I email the ledger to Ivan, and you won't make it to lunch." The line went dead. Richard sat in the silence, the hum of the server room, the only sound. He was trapped. He had no leverage, no allies, and no time. He had to go to the bank. He had to face the plumber. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a snub-nose .38 revolver. He checked the cylinder. It was loaded. "I'm not going to jail," Richard muttered to his reflection in the dark window. "And I'm not dying for a plumber." Thursday morning broke grey and miserable. The rain had returned, washing the streets of the city in a grim metallic sheen. At 7:55 a.m., Richard's Porsche screeched to a halt in front of Sovereign Capital. He didn't park. He just left it there. He marched up to the glass doors. He looked wrecked. His eyes were all red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He wore the same suit from the day before, now rumpled and stained with sweat. The security guard, Frank, the same man who had intervened 2 days ago, was standing inside. He saw Richard and hesitated. Richard held up his platinum banking card against the glass, his other hand in his pocket, clutching the cold steel of the gun. Frank buzzed him in. The bank was empty of customers. The lights were half dimmed. Standing in the center of the lobby, right where Sarah had fallen, was Arthur. Arthur looked different. He wasn't wearing his flannel shirt or his work boots. He was wearing a dark, fitted trench coat. He stood with a posture that was military straight. He didn't look like a plumber. He looked like an executioner. "Where is it?" Richard barked, his voice echoing in the vaulted hall. "Where is the authorization?" "Good morning to you too, Richard," Arthur said calmly. "Cut the crap." Richard pulled the gun from his pocket and pointed it at Arthur's chest. Frank the guard gasped and reached for his radio, but Arthur held up a hand. "It's okay, Frank. Let him play." "You think this is a game?" Richard stepped closer, the gun shaking in his hand. "I will kill you, old man. I have nothing to lose. Logan, approve the transfer." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked at the gun with mild disinterest. "You've never held a weapon before, Richard. Your safety is still on." Richard looked down, frantically fumbling with the catch. In that split second, Arthur moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for a man of his age. Arthur stepped in, slapped the gun barrel aside with his left hand, and drove his right palm into Richard's solar plexus. Richard gagged the air, leaving his lungs in a whoosh. He doubled over. Arthur twisted the gun out of his hand, ejected the bullets, and tossed the weapon across the marble floor. It skittered away with a clatter. Richard fell to his knees, wheezing, clutching his chest. "I told you," Arthur said, standing over him. "I wasn't always a plumber." "Please," Richard gasped, looking up. The arrogance was gone. He was a broken child. "Please, Arthur, they're going to kill me. The Volkovs. They don't forgive." "I know," Arthur said. "That's why I invited them." Richard's eyes went wide. "What?" The heavy oak doors of the manager's office opened, but it wasn't the manager who stepped out. It was 2 men in dark suits. They were thick-necked, grim-faced, and distinctly Eastern European. Behind them was a third man, Saul holding a tablet. "Mr. Sterling," the taller Russian said, his voice like grinding stones. "Ivan sends his regards." Richard scrambled backward on the floor, crab walking away from them. No, I was going to pay you back. I swear it was a liquidity issue." "We saw the ledger," the Russian said, stepping closer. "Arthur sent it to us. You have been stealing from the family for 2 years, $3 million. Richard looked at Arthur, tears streaming down his face. "You? You sold me to them. You killed me. No, Arthur said coldly. I gave you a choice. I told you if you came here and did what I said you might live. Arthur turned to Saul. Play it. Saul tapped the tablet. Suddenly, the large monitors on the wall, usually used for displaying interest rates, flickered to life. It was the video footage from Tuesday. Clear, high-definition video and audio. Richard shouting. Sarah begging for $20. Richard kicking her. Sarah falling. The sound of the kick echoed through the silent bank. Richard stared at the screen, horrified. You said the tape was gone. I recovered it, Saul said from the back. Deleted files are never really deleted, Richard. Not when you know where to look. Arthur stepped between Richard and the Russians. He looked at the hitmen. Gentlemen, Arthur said. You want your money back. I can authorize the transfer from the Spectre account right now. All $3 million. Returned to the Volkovs. The lead Russian paused. And the price? He is the price, Arthur gestured to Richard. We take him with us, the Russian asked. No, Arthur said firmly. If you take him, he disappears. That's too easy. I want him to suffer. I want him to rot. Arthur pointed to the glass doors of the bank. Blue and red lights were flashing outside. Sirens were wailing, getting louder. The police are here, Arthur said. I sent the video to the district attorney 10 minutes ago. Domestic abuse assault with a deadly weapon and, thanks to Saul's digging, massive fraud and embezzlement. Arthur looked down at Richard. Here is the deal, Richard. The Russians get their money back, so they don't kill you today. In exchange, you go to prison. You go to prison for a long, long time. And while you are inside, you will have nothing. No money, no lawyers, no friends. The Russians looked at each other, then at the flashing lights outside. They nodded. We get our money, we leave. We don't care about the police. Arthur pulled out his phone, authorized the transfer with his thumbprint, and showed the screen to the Russian. Done. The Russians turned and exited through the back employee entrance just as the front doors burst open. Police hands in the air. Detective Harrow. The one who had dismissed Sarah's claims rushed in, followed by 4 uniformed officers. They saw Richard on his knees, sobbing. They saw Arthur standing calmly with his hands up. It's over, Richard. Arthur said, his voice low enough that only Richard could hear. You kicked my daughter. You lost your life. Richard looked at the police, then back at the empty space where the Russians had been. He realized the horrifying truth. Prison was now the only safe place for him. If he ever got out, the Russians would be waiting. He held his hands out for the cuffs, weeping uncontrollably. Arthur watched as they dragged him away. He didn't smile. He just checked his watch. It was 8:15 a.m. Time to go see the baby, Arthur said to Frank. Frank, wide-eyed, just nodded. Yes, sir. Have a good day, sir. Arthur walked out into the rain, but for the first time in days the sun was trying to break through the clouds. The 6 months leading up to the trial of Richard Sterling were not measured in hours or days, but in the slow, agonizing drip of water in a county jail cell. For Richard, the fall from grace hadn't been a slide. It had been a cliff dive. He had gone from sipping vintage scotch in a penthouse overlooking Central Park to drinking lukewarm tap water from a stainless steel sink next to a toilet. He had lost his suit, his reputation, and his name. In the cell block, he wasn't the CEO of Sterling and Oakhaven. He was inmate 7740, or, as the other prisoners called him, with a sneer, the kicker. News of the assault had gone viral. The video footage Saul had recovered from the bank's server didn't just make the local news. It became a global symbol of corporate arrogance and domestic cruelty. Richard Sterling was the most hated man in New York City, but Richard, delusional to the bitter end, still believed he could win. He sat in his cell scribbling notes on legal pads, convinced that his high-priced lawyer, Timothy Thorne, would find a technicality. He believed the Spectre account and Arthur's interference were illegal entrapment. He believed he could spin the narrative. He was wrong. Timothy Thorne hadn't come to visit him in 3 months. When Thorne finally did show up 2 days before the trial, he wasn't there to strategize. He was there to resign. "You're toxic, Richard," Thorne had said, standing on the safe side of the plexiglass, not even bothering to sit down. "The Bar Association is breathing down my neck just for representing you. The Volkov evidence, it's watertight. The video, it's 4K definition of you being a monster. I'm off the case. You have a public defender now." "You can't do this," Richard had screamed, pounding the glass until his knuckles bled. "I made you. I have millions stashed away." "You have nothing," Thorne replied, coldly checking his watch. "Arthur Miller froze the Cayman accounts this morning. The Fed seized your properties. You're destitute, Richard. Good luck with the public defender. I hear she's fresh out of law school." The morning of the sentencing was crisp and bright, a stark contrast to the gloomy, rain-slicked day of the assault. The mood outside the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse was electric. A sea of reporters, cameras, and protesters stood behind barricades. They held signs, "Justice for Sarah Real-Men, Don't Kick and Rot in Hell, Sterling." Inside the courtroom was packed to capacity. It smelled of floor wax and old wood, a heavy, somber atmosphere that pressed down on everyone present. When the bailiffs led Richard in, a hush fell over the room. He looked like a ghost of his former self. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and grey. His skin was pasty, the result of months without sunlight. He wore an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his emaciated frame. He scanned the gallery with frantic, darting eyes. He wasn't looking for friends, he knew he had none left. He was looking for assassins. He was terrified that the Volkov syndicate had planted someone in the room to finish the job Arthur Miller had started. Then the doors opened and Sarah entered. The transformation was breathtaking. Gone was the terrified, rain-soaked woman in the worn-out coat. Sarah walked with her head held high, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress. In her arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was Leo. The baby was 3 months old, healthy and alert. Sarah didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the reporters. She walked straight to the front row, flanked on one side by a security detail, and on the other by her father. Arthur Miller wore a suit for the first time in 20 years. It was charcoal grey, perfectly tailored, and although it was old-fashioned, it made him look distinguished, dangerous even. He didn't look like a plumber. He walked with the fluid, predatory grace of a man who had walked through war zones and come out the other side without a scratch. He sat next to Sarah, placing a protective hand on the back of her chair. The trial itself was a massacre. The public defender, a young woman named Ms. Alcott, did her best, but she was fighting a tsunami with a teaspoon. The prosecution didn't just play the video of the kick, they played it in slow motion. They zoomed in on Richard's face, twisting with rage. They played the audio of Sarah begging for $20 for vitamins. The jury was weeping. Even the stenographer had to pause to wipe her eyes. Then came the financial crimes. Saul's work had been thorough. The prosecution laid out the web of shell companies, the money laundering for the Russian mob, the embezzlement of employee pension funds. They painted a picture of a man who was not just a domestic abuser, but a financial predator who would sell his own soul for a profit. Richard sat slumped at the defense table, refusing to look at the screen. He kept glancing at Arthur. Arthur sat motionless, his face a mask of stone, watching the proceedings, with the detached interest of an entomologist watching a bug under a microscope. Before the sentencing, the judge offered Richard a chance to speak. This was the moment Richard had rehearsed in his head 1,000 times. He stood up, his chains rattling. He intended to sound contrite, to beg for mercy, to blame the stress of the business. "Your Honor," Richard croaked, his voice rusty from disuse. I was under immense pressure. The market, the investors." He stopped. He looked at Sarah. She was looking right at him. Her eyes weren't filled with fear anymore. They were filled with absolute indifference. It was the look you give a stranger on the subway. That indifference broke him more than anger ever could. "It's not my fault," Richard suddenly shrieked, the facade cracking. "She provoked me. She came to my place of business. She was trying to ruin me and him." He pointed a shaking finger at Arthur. "That old man. He's not a plumber. He's a ghost. He set me up. He controls the accounts. Arrest him." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Harrison banged his gavel furiously. "Order. Order in this court. Mr. Sterling, sit down immediately or be held in contempt." Richard collapsed back into his chair, panting wild-eyed. He looked insane. He realized too late that Arthur had won completely. By ranting about conspiracies and ghosts, Richard had just sealed his reputation as a lunatic. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked down at Richard with pure disdain. "Richard Sterling," the judge began, his voice booming without a microphone. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen men who killed for passion and men who stole for hunger. I can understand those men. But you are something else entirely. You are a man who had everything and destroyed it out of pure, unadulterated vanity." The judge leaned forward. "You attacked a pregnant woman, your own wife. You endangered the life of an unborn child. You stole from the innocent to pay criminals. You have shown zero remorse, only self-pity." The pen scratched across the paper. "For the charges of aggravated assault, wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny, I hereby sentence you to the maximum penalty allowed under federal law. You are sentenced to 25 years in the federal penitentiary. Furthermore, due to the nature of your financial crimes and your flight risk, you are denied the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. As the bailiffs hauled Richard up, the reality set in. 25 years. He would be 65 when he got out. If he got out. He looked at the gallery. The Russians weren't there. But he knew they were waiting. The Volkovs had reach everywhere. Prison was the only place safe from them. Yet even there, he would be looking over his shoulder every single day. As they dragged him down the center aisle, he passed Arthur. Arthur stood up slowly. He blocked Richard's view of Sarah and the baby. Richard slowed down, his feet dragging. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of hate and awe. "Who are you?" "The agency CIA." "Who?" Arthur leaned in. No one else could hear him over the commotion of the courtroom. "It doesn't matter who I was, Richard," Arthur said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm the grandfather of the boy you tried to hurt. That's the only title that matters." "They'll come for you," Richard hissed. "The Russians." Arthur smiled. It was a terrifying, cold smile. They already came. We had tea. We came to an understanding. They got their money back. You're the payment, Richard. You're the sacrifice. Richard's blood ran cold. He realized then that his prison sentence wasn't just punishment from the law. It was part of a deal Arthur had brokered with the mob. Richard was being served up to the wolves, locked in a cage where he could never escape his fear. "Move it," the bailiff grunted, shoving Richard forward. Richard Sterling disappeared through the heavy oak doors, weeping into his hands while the courtroom erupted in applause. 2 weeks later, the spring sun was setting over the small town of Oakhaven. The air smelled of blooming lilacs and fresh-cut grass. Arthur's small house had changed. There were toys scattered on the lawn. A stroller was parked on the porch. The silence that had defined Arthur's life for so long was replaced by the soft sounds of a radio playing jazz and the occasional coo of a baby. Sarah sat on the porch swing, rocking Leo to sleep. She looked at the paper in her hand. It was a check from the Victims' Compensation Fund, combined with the settlement from the bank's negligence lawsuit. It was substantial. Enough to start over. Enough to be free. Arthur walked out of the screen door, carrying 2 glasses of iced lemonade. He had shed the suit. He was back in his flannel shirt and worn jeans, his hands stained with grease from working on the neighbor's tractor. "He's asleep," Arthur asked softly, handing her a glass. "Finally." Sarah smiled, looking down at her son. "He has your chin, Dad." Arthur chuckled, sitting in his rocking chair. "Poor kid. Hopefully he gets your brains." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies begin to dance near the tree line. "Dad?" Sarah said, breaking the silence. She hesitated, tracing the rim of her glass. "I never asked you the full story. The encryption codes, Saul, the way you handled the Volkoffs, the way you broke Richard's wrist in the lobby without even sweating." Arthur took a sip of his lemonade, looking out at the horizon. His eyes, usually crinkled with warmth, went distant for a moment. He looked like he was seeing a different desert, a different war. "You don't need to know the details, Sarah," he said gently. "That was a different life, a life I left behind, so I could fix pipes and raise a daughter." "But you went back to it," she said. "For me." "I opened a door I had locked," Arthur admitted. "I dusted off some old tools, but the door is closed again. Saul is back in retirement. The Spectre account is closed." "Richard said you were a ghost," Sarah whispered. Arthur turned to her. The fierce, terrifying intensity he had shown in the bank was gone, replaced by the loving gaze of a father. "I'm not a ghost, sweetie. I'm just a plumber. I fix leaks. Richard was a leak, a nasty one. But he's fixed now." He reached out and stroked Leo's soft hair with his calloused, rough finger. "This is what matters," Arthur said. "The future. We don't look back. We just make sure the foundation is strong so the house doesn't fall down again." Sarah leaned her head on her father's shoulder. She felt safe. For the first time in years, the knot of anxiety in her chest was completely gone. She knew that whatever challenges life threw at them, whatever monsters tried to knock on their door, they wouldn't get past the porch. Because the old man sitting in the rocking chair, sipping lemonade and complaining about his knees, was the most dangerous man on earth when it came to protecting his family. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. Arthur smiled, closing his eyes as the wind rustled the trees. "Any time, kiddo." anytime. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for the Sterling family, now the Miller family, the long, dark night was finally over. And that, my friends, is the end of the line for Richard Sterling. He learned the hard way that you can't measure a man's worth by his bank account, and you certainly can't judge a father's power by his job title. Richard thought he was the shark in the water, but he didn't realize he was swimming with a kraken. It's a satisfying end, isn't it? Seeing the arrogance stripped away, leaving only the consequences. It reminds us that true strength isn't about how loud you can yell or how hard you can kick. It's about how far you're willing to go to protect the people you love. Arthur Miller hung up his cape years ago to pick up a wrench, but he proved that heroes don't retire. They just wait for the right moment. I hope you enjoyed this 7-part saga of betrayal, revenge, and justice. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. It tells YouTube that you want more stories like this, and if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We have a brand new story coming next week about a lottery winner who tries to hide his jackpot from his family. You won't want to miss that drama. Leave a comment down below. Do you think Richard's sentence was long enough, or should Arthur have let the Russians take him? I read every comment. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and remember, be kind to everyone, because you never know who you're really talking to.